Respondent in the appeal, Shahid and the Scottish Ministers.
Lord Reid will explain the decision of the court.
This appeal concerns the use of solitary confinement, otherwise known as segregation, in prisons. In 2006, the appellant and his two co-accused were convicted of the racially aggravated abduction and murder of a 15-year-old boy. On being remanded in custody in October 2005, the three accused were segregated because it was believed that they were liable to be attacked by other prisoners. Apart from a period immediately before and during his trial, the appellant remained in segregation until August 2010, a period of 56 months. For a prisoner to be kept in segregation for such a long period of approaching 5 years is exceptional. In these proceedings, the appellant seeks orders declaring that certain periods of his segregation were in breach of relevant legislation contained in the prison rules approved by the Scottish Parliament, and that his segregation violated Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the prohibition on inhuman and degrading treatment, and Article 8, the right to respect for private life. His application for judicial review was refused by both the outer house and the inner house of the Court of Session, and he now appeals to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court unanimously allows his appeal. In relation to the prison rules, prison governors can authorise segregation for up to 72 hours, but segregation for any longer period must be authorised by the Scottish ministers before the 72-hour period has expired. It is accepted that there were a number of occasions when the ministers failed to comply with that time limit. The question is whether, nevertheless, it was lawful to keep the appellant in segregation after the 72 hours had expired. The Supreme Court holds that it was not. That follows from the terms of the rules. They provide that a prisoner shall not be subject to segregation for a period in excess of 72 hours, except where the ministers have granted authority prior to the expiry of the 72-hour period. In relation to Article 3 of the Convention, the conditions in which the appellant were kept were not inhuman or degrading. The purpose of his segregation was to protect his safety, and there were reasonable grounds for believing that he was at risk of attack. He was not entirely isolated from contact with other prisoners and staff. He suffered some ill effects from his prolonged segregation, but his health does not appear to have been severely or permanently affected. In these circumstances, the Court concludes that there was no violation of Article 3. In relation to Article 8 of the Convention, it is accepted by the ministers that segregation is an interference with the right protected by Article 8, and that therefore it must pursue a legitimate aim, be in accordance with the law, and be a proportionate means of achieving the aim pursued. In this case, there is no doubt that the segregation pursued a legitimate aim, namely the protection of the appellant's safety. It was not, however, in accordance with the law insofar as it was in breach of the prison rules. As I've explained, there was a breach of the rules when the appellant was kept in segregation after the 72-hour time limit had expired and no authorisation had been granted by the ministers in accordance with the time limits. There was a further breach of the rules on a number of occasions when prison governors applied to the ministers to authorise continued segregation, not on the basis of the governor's own assessment of whether continued segregation was justified, as the rules required, but because they were implementing decisions already taken by a prison service committee. The ministers have also failed to demonstrate that the period for which the appellant was kept in segregation was proportionate. Some possible alternatives to segregation were not considered. No meaningful plan for the appellant's reintegration into the prison population was put in place until he had already been in segregation for more than 4.5 years. There was, therefore, a breach of Article 8. The Supreme Court has, however, concluded that the appellant should not be awarded damages. It is accepted that he was not prejudiced by the minister's failure to comply with the time limits in the prison rules. Nor, in the Court's view, was he prejudiced by the governors deferring to the views of the Prison Service Committee, as it appears that the governors would themselves have reached the same conclusion in any event. Whether the appellant's segregation might have ended sooner if a management plan had been put in place at an earlier stage is uncertain. any harm that he may have suffered as a result of being deprived of contact with other prisoners for longer than necessary was limited, given, amongst other factors, the attitude of other prisoners towards him. In these circumstances, the Court considers that the appropriate remedy is an order declaring that the appellant was segregated without lawful authority during 3 specified periods, and that the circumstances of his segregation violated his rights under Article 8 of the Convention.
Thank you.